We continue in the letter to the Hebrews today. We are looking at Hebrews chapter 5. This is a discussion about high priestliness. And I'm going to refer actually also to chapter 7 of Hebrews because this is kind of continued there. But for now, we'll just read what we're supposed to read. So, from chapter 5. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. They are able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since they themselves are subject to weakness. And because of this, they must offer sacrifice for their own sins as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayer and supplication with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. About this we have much to say that is hard to explain, since you have become dull in understanding. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic elements of the oracles of God. This is the word of the Lord. Now, if you had a nickel for every time that I talked about Melchizedek, as of today, you'd have one nickel. Because as I was reading this, it occurred to me, I had no idea who that was. So Melchizedek is a weird name, right? It's a weird name. It pops up in the New Testament where there's not a lot of weird names. But it turns out that Melchizedek was a person referenced in the Old Testament as well. Probably not quite as familiar to us, but more familiar in some other traditions. Melchizedek is a saint in the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition. He's one of those characters, and what I love so much about having learned now about Melchizedek is that he's one of those characters that is so easy to pass over. I mean, he basically has like an honorable mention, and you can just read right past it. But his significance is substantial when you pay attention to who he actually was and who he wasn't. So Melchizedek, the person, only appears in Genesis 14. That's the only place we see him. Melchizedek is in the presence of Abram or Abraham, and he offers Abraham bread and wine as a blessing. The order of Melchizedek, that phrase actually appears also in Psalms and now in Hebrews. So suddenly this order of Melchizedek appears to be popping up in a variety of places. What exactly the order of Melchizedek is a lot more nebulous and more difficult to explain. But that said, it's clearly a designation that somehow lasted from this weird little passage in Genesis all the way to the letter to the Hebrews in its reference to Christ, right? As I said, the interesting thing about Melchizedek is who he was and what he did in that moment in Genesis, but also who he wasn't. So what do we know about Melchizedek, the person? Melchizedek was the priest king of Salem. His name in Hebrew is often two different words, and they mean king of righteousness, basically, translated. His name also, king of Salem, means king of peace, right? Salem meaning peace in its Hebrew iterations. He appears in Genesis 14. He is blessing Abraham after his conquest of some enemy. As a result of this blessing, Abraham then gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. He appears to offer what we could only call communion, bread and wine to Abraham, and in response receives a tithe from Abraham of 1/10. That's all fascinating. That's all interesting. The more fascinating question, though, is where the heck did this guy come from? And who was he? Because here's the thing about Melchizedek that is important. Melchizedek was not a high priest by lineage. He was not a high priest by birth. He was not born into the Levitical class of priests, right? He was not part of any inherited power or any organized structure that we can seem to figure out here. His power, his priesthood, appears to come almost entirely from the idea that he's an incredibly faithful human being, as close to the archetype of Christ as one could be in the Old Testament. He is a transcendent person, not bound to the same human systems and traditions and rules that would normally govern in this particular case, especially so early on. He was a high priest because he was a good guy. Not perfect, of course, because he's human, but he was good. He was a high priest because God chose him to be a high priest. That is his pedigree. That's it. We know very little else about this person. In fact, some folks seem to think he was injected later and wasn't actually in there. We don't know. But the point is, he's there. And as I say to the Bible study class all the time, if it's there, we got to deal with it, right? So here he is. Melchizedek appears in Genesis. He's referred to in Psalms as this Order of Melchizedek, which seems to suggest some kind of priestly order of people who aren't priests because of their lineage. They aren't priests because of who their fathers are. They are priests because God decided they were good enough to do that. Now, of course, Melchizedek, in so many ways, becomes, as I said earlier, archetypal of the idea of Jesus, right? He is this kind of benevolent figure that appears. He offers bread and wine, this sort of mini communion that has yet to be called communion, obviously, in Genesis. But here he is, this great high priest, this king, right? So he's not just a priest, he's a priest king. So he also represents this bizarre smushing together of religious and political authority at the same time. He's apparently a just king, right? He's a good king, a good person, a person who is apparently guided by his covenant with God to do what is right. Now, we are Reformed Protestants, the last time I checked. And so we don't get real jazzed about priestly hierarchies, right? We don't like that idea. Like priestly caste systems are not our thing, right? For us, there is only one, and as Hebrews will tell us, right, there is only one great high priest, and that is Jesus. Jesus is the only high priest, the only head of the church. He is the source from which all ministry and mission originates. And then there's the rest of us. The rest of us fall into a category that we as Presbyterians know is called the priesthood of all believers, right? This idea that everybody belongs to this kind of great priesthood of Christ, this idea that we are all called upon to proclaim this good news that Christ brought into the world. We are the priesthood of all believers. We receive our bread and wine only from the very last Melchizedek, the last high priest, the only high priest, the Messiah whose priesthood, unlike Melchizedek's, could not be ended. His priesthood is eternal because Jesus Christ did not stay dead. As much as they tried to silence the priesthood of Jesus, Jesus got up again. And so his priesthood is eternal in that sense, the sense that it cannot be changed, taken, broken, and it cannot be interrupted by any human machinations. The eternal priesthood. The priesthood we are invited to participate in is an eternal concept. It lasts beyond us. It lasts beyond this moment. And Melchizedek reminds us that despite our very, very obvious humanness, our weakness, our ability to sin, ad nauseum in some cases, we are still participants in this very sacred idea. We are part of a priesthood, designated by God to work together to form a more perfect unity within the church, a more perfect faith, a more perfect expression of Jesus on the earth, as neighbors and co-workers in this mission together. Unity with God is our goal as we work to emulate the priesthood of Christ. And as far as I can tell, having read the little blurb in Genesis, and then if you read Hebrews 7, they elaborate a little bit on what exactly this order of Melchizedek might be, or what it means exactly. But from what I can tell, it requires three things from us to belong to this order, to be this priesthood of all believers. It requires from us humility, it requires from us obedience, and it requires from us empathy. Solid values across the board, right? Things we talk about in faith all the time. Our priestliness is defined by our willingness to become humble, to become obedient to the will of God and the work of Christ, and to empathize with the suffering and the sinning of other people around us. Humility begins with a very simple recognition that we cannot become part of this priesthood because we feel like it. We can only become part of this priesthood because we are invited to it. It belongs not to us, it belongs to God. We are chosen to serve. I know that language well. I took vows of ordination, right? And guess what? So did most of you. The same ones. As one, I guess the one unique thing maybe that I carry with me is that I was not a Christian my whole life. I'm a convert, whatever you want to say, right? In fact, the one story that I've probably told most in my life is this conversion story of mine, which I'm not going to go through today because most of you have heard it. If not, stay tuned, it'll probably come up again. But when I tell that story, inevitably people want to kind of cling to what I call the spicy parts of it, right? There was this kind of supernatural sensation, right? This idea that God had suddenly invaded my life in this very real and very strange way, right? So there's this mystery, there's this kind of supernaturalness, right? This God that is above all of these other things, right? And so that's the fun part. That's the exciting part, right? Because faith is fun when we feel the presence of God, right? Faith is fun with all the excitement of the first believing, of the first hearing, right? Of the first being noticed or recognized by God in your mind. But there's another part. A part that I focus less on because people's eyes glaze over when I start to talk about it. And that's this. When I experienced conversion, right, when I decided to become a person of faith, I knew two fundamental things. Number one, my life no longer belonged to me. My life was not my own. I had been touched and chosen by something I could not explain or understand. I still can't. So I knew instantly that nothing could be the same as it was the moment before this happened. The second thing I felt, and this is the one people get really twitchy about, was an overwhelming sense of responsibility. An overwhelming sense that I was no longer allowed to sit by, that I was no longer allowed to stand back, that I was no longer allowed to just participate. That I now had a responsibility not just to my own faith, but I had a responsibility to my brothers and sisters, my siblings everywhere. That every neighbor was now somehow part of this great responsibility. It's a responsibility, by the way, that we sign up for willingly. when we decide to participate in this thing that we call church. And every time I start talking about words like obedience and responsibility and work, suddenly conversion seems a little less sexy and no one wants to talk about it anymore, right? Because then it's hard, right? Look, I did not know that conversion was going to lead to me being Reverend Ben standing up in front of a room in my garish sweaters preaching to you about God knows what, right? I did not know that at the time. All I knew was that faith was not a passive activity. I wasn't making a promise to just participate. I was making a promise to be fully and completely present in the world, to nurture and to feed as I saw people needing to be nurtured and fed without any care for who they are or what they are or where they've been or what they've done. I understood that faith is the active work of being the church. That work is the covenant that we make with God. It's the covenant that has followed us from the beginning. It's the covenant that Melchizedek would have celebrated in his blessing of Abraham. It's the same covenant that Hebrews reminds us of. It is the covenant that is eternal, that lasts with us from the moment we say yes to God to the moment that all of this goes silent and beyond. Jesus, our Melchizedek, makes it clear that we are called to humbly heed God's call to serve, to proclaim, to feed, to heal, and to teach, and that not a single one of us gets the opportunity to shirk any of those duties. They are part of the responsibility of faith. They are what we are called to do. Our lives are not our own. Our faith is more than our professions and our proclamations and our public displays of piety. Our faith is an obedience to the values of Christ, to the values of peace, to the importance of service, and to a crucial selflessness that is willing to sacrifice and give whatever it takes to bring life to a neighbor. Priesthood, leadership in the church, and we are Presbyterians, we are all leaders in the church, requires a humble submission to the possibilities presented by Christ, to the possibilities of transformation, to the possibilities of new ways to love and to show mercy and to create peace in the world. That is what we are called to be obedient to. Not a bunch of endlessly listed laws about your personal behavior or your dietary restrictions. Our obedience is to the values of Christ. That is what makes us Christian. Because if you read Hebrews closely, what does it say in our chapter, right? It says later in chapter 7 that any time the priesthood changes, there must essentially be a change in the law. Jesus Christ was that change. Jesus Christ was the reinterpretation of the law, not because he was holy, not because he was a priest, but because he was the living, walking, talking Word of God in the world. And perhaps most of all, Jesus taught us the one thing that is so excruciating, but so essential to the health and the future of our faith, and that was the simple ability to empathize, to look at a neighbor and see not enemies and not differences, but to see shared experience. Empathy with the weak because we know what it feels like to be weak. Empathy with the sinful because every single one of us has done it. Empathy with the suffering because most of us know what it means to suffer on a variety of levels, in a variety of ways. Jesus summons forth that empathy and says that is the guide forward. Not your judgment of others, not your legalism around others, not your need to feel superior to others. The only thing that guides you forward in faith is an excruciating empathy, a willingness to relate to every person you meet and see in them the same face of God that you wear on your face. Because the one great experience that every single one of us shares is that we are children of God, called into the order of Melchizedek in our service to Christ, to bless and to feed. So from Melchizedek to Jesus, the responsibilities are the same. The obedience is the same. And the need for empathy remains the same. And all of that leads to a new church, defined not by its weakness, not by its faltering numbers, but defined by its empathy that is so powerful it cannot help but change everyone it touches. That's what church is. Amen.